Hello, welcome to this session. It's great to see so many people here interested in this. So I'm going to talk about the Google Analytics of things. So this is something I got interested in a couple of years ago, and it's, I think, a really fascinating area. So just a bit of background. So I work for the Association for Learning Technology, which is a membership organization, and so as a membership body, we're interested in the interplay between learning and technology. And so some of this work relates to that, but a lot of it isn't really my day job. So one of the things I do is I kind of work within the community, and I've been using a product called Google Apps Script for a number of years, and I got pulled into this program called Google Developers Experts, which is a worldwide community of people not employed by Google. We're just people like you out there using Google products and just kind of being very noisy about it. And it was through this experts program that I actually, it pulls people together from various products, various Google products. And it was at one of we have an annual summit where we get together, and it was at one of these summits that I started talking to the Google Analytics developer experts and just discovering some of the really interesting things that you can do with Google Analytics as a platform, which you might not necessarily think of in the beginning. In particular, there was one guy, Nico Michelli, who I've collaborated a couple of times on various presentations. He's no longer a Google Developers Expert. He actually works for Google now, so he's no longer part of the program, but I continue to follow Nico with interest in terms of the things that he does around analytics. And that's where really this presentation comes from. It was something that Nico had started putting together. I contributed a couple of slides to, but really the hat tip goes to Nico in terms of this. So I can't really say I'm an expert in Google Analytics, but I'm in that kind of precarious point where I know dangerously little, and I can do, I think, interesting things, which hopefully I can encourage you to go off and do slightly interesting or innovative things as well. So really this talk is about inspiring you, just making you aware of what's available in Google Analytics in terms of what you can do, some of the opportunities you might be missing at this point. But let's rewind a bit back to the beginning of the internet. So it's, I think last week or so, it was actually 50 years of ARPANET. So, you know, the internet has been around for a very long time, and back in the beginning it was very easy if you were wanting to do any sort of analytics, because web pages were very basic. You know, it was, you might have had some information, you know, some links. You know, it's very static content. Nowadays we've got a whole host of web technologies, you know, just building on HTML5 and JavaScript. There's so much that you can do, and so a web page is no longer a piece of static content. It's incredibly dynamic. So in terms of analytics, you know, if you're measuring, you know, hits to your web page, there's so much more that you should be doing in terms of interaction with buttons. You've got infinite scrolling, you've got content coming in from different sources. So, you know, in terms of trying to measure something and get actionable insight out of it, page views don't really cut it anymore. So if you are wanting to do something with this, you know, there are various products out there. So I think in terms of analytics, I think it's PyWiki or something like that, but Google Analytics is probably the one you've heard of. I think the last time I looked, it was something like 80% of trackable websites were using Google Analytics. So they have a big marketplace. And it's a really interesting tool. So in terms of tracking stuff, this is Nico's slide. So I bring the Scottish accent, that's all I bring to this slide. So Nico described it as the clean, elegant, and easy to use, and for the Pierce Brosnan fans, customizable to handle anything. So how many of you are deploying Google Analytics within your realm on your web spaces? So if you've got people using Google Analytics in your organization, this is probably what they're doing. They're dropping in some JavaScript into your web pages and just setting up your tracking essentially. So by including this code, you're immediately getting a page view hit. But if you want to do more than that, there's some additional customization that you need to do. So, for example, you want to track a button hit. Basically, it's a case of providing some additional code just so that you can send that data into Google Analytics. So when the button's clicked, you're firing an event of the type button. You can put different categories and labels and values onto this. One thing to say is if you're doing this on scale, you can obviously use various JavaScript libraries or your framework to integrate this into it. But another product if you haven't looked at, and I encourage you to check out, is Google Tag Manager. So this is a cloud-based platform that Google provide. So similar to Google Analytics, you're dropping in a piece of JavaScript code into your web pages. But what Google Tag Manager does is it actually gives you a cloud console where you can deploy various bits and pieces. So Google Analytics is kind of one of the easy things you can do with Google Tag Manager. We actually use it in our organization because what you can do with Google Tag Manager is actually modify parts of your web page. So you might be asking, why would you want to do that? We have a number of out-the-box solutions where we have very little control over the features and functionalities within those products, but we can do a degree of styling, which means I can drop in the Google Tag Manager bit of JavaScript, and then I can start manipulating the whole DOM from a cloud based on rules and triggers and tags. That's a slight aside. Any Google Tag Manager? Anyone heard of Google Tag Fan? So that's kind of Google Analytics. Something that's very important to know is that with Google Analytics, you can do a lot of tracking, but you cannot put any personal identifiable information into Google Analytics. That's a breach of their terms and conditions, and if they discover that you're doing that, they will just pull your account. So it's got a bit more interesting recently with GDPR, and I'll get onto that in a second. But what Google Analytics does permit you to do is to provide a user ID and a client ID. So a user ID could be some piece of information that you've got that relates a user to their activity on your website. So when they're logged in, you provide them with a user ID that you can then track their journey. So, for example, if you're doing a commerce platform, when they're registered and signed in, you can actually start seeing their flow between the things that they put in their basket, wherever they go, finish the checkout, and so on. The client ID is more device-based, so you can actually start tracking people across devices. So if, for example, your e-commerce platform also has a mobile app, you can specify a client ID for the mobile app, a different one for the website, and again, it gives you extra layers of analysis that you can do. So I mentioned GDPR. So how many are you familiar with GDPR and living the joy? GDPR, for me personally, it's a double-edged sword. So personally, I enjoy and like the fact that I have more in theory control over my data. But as someone that has to deal with data, it does put additional requirements on us to be transparent, to actually not just grab data because it's there, but to have a purpose for the way that we're using data. And it also requires us to have a lawful basis for using personal data. So obviously within Google Analytics, we've got that layer of you can't send anything personal into Google Analytics, but as a user, if I'm back to my e-commerce example, if I'm providing a user ID to put into Google Analytics, I need consent from the user to do that. So you need a lawful basis. So it's not a case of let's just grab everything and just throw it into Google Analytics. You need to think about how that relates to things like GDPR. So I mentioned privacy and consent. Also, in terms of anonymizing your data, so you can do pseudo-anonymization and anonymization, which is slightly different. So something like pseudo-anonymization will take something and scramble it up. So the letters of that person's name are still in the data. They're in a different order, but they're in a order that you can reconstruct this data. Because of the letter Y has gone to the first place and everyone is shifted down one as a result. So it's not completely anonymized. And then you have something like anonymity, where you're taking something very distinct like an age and you're categorizing it. The reason I'm mentioning these things in relation to Google Analytics is how you choose to use someone's personal data and how you either anonymize it or pseudo-anonymize it actually impacts the rights of the individual in terms of what they can get access to. If you get the slides, you'll see a link to a blog post that explains some of this. So I mentioned in that e-commerce example, it's going beyond the web now. So one of the options within Google Analytics, so I showed you the web tracking code, there's actually just a very simple measurement protocol, which is an API which you can hit and just put data into Google Analytics. So it doesn't have to be coming from a web page. It can be essentially anything that can make a HTTP request can be sending data into Google Analytics. So so you can send, obviously it's not going to, in terms of the data you send in, it's going to be data that Google Analytics would expect. So things like hits, counts of stuff, timings. So it's not a case of you can just shove any data you want into Google Analytics. It's still got to conform to the type of data that Google Analytics can actually process. So this means that you can start integrating Google Analytics, and people do already have, into things like smart TVs, kiosks, point of sale, back-end applications, and the one I'm particularly interested in is any sort of web-connected device. So Raspberry Pi, Arduino, anything like that can potentially take the data and just hit Google Analytics with it. So the basics. So in terms of what you can send into Google Analytics, there are a couple of key things. So your tracking ID is your universal tracking ID. So this tracking ID can be used for your website and also for whatever else you're wanting to throw in with the measurement protocol. You also have a client ID, so you've got a way of identifying a user, but remembering all the GDPR caveats about what you do with that, and a hit type. So in this case, got a page view hit type. But there are different hit types. So out of the box, you can do things like page, event, e-commerce stuff, social interactions, timings, and you can actually make your own custom hit types. So you're not limited to these. But again, it's back to counts of stuff that you can put in. Another interesting thing about the measurement protocol is you can actually provide a queue time. So if you're collecting data when a device is offline, when that device comes back online, you can send your data into Google Analytics. And providing a queue time basically offsets the data. So if something happened 10 minutes ago and you want to keep that timestamp as 10 minutes ago, you can use a queue time parameter in your data to say, this thing just happened, it happened 10 minutes ago. So when you go into the Google Analytics interface and look at this data, you're getting true data in terms of when did the actual event happen. The other thing you can do is you can send stuff in batches, so you're not limited to just sending one thing in at a time, which when you're using smaller devices, and particularly IoT devices, you might want to limit the amount of runtime that you've got. It might be to preserve battery, it might be just because it's more cost efficient. So with the measurement protocol, you can actually batch stuff up into payloads of 20 hits of stuff and send that in one go. So with queue time and batch stuff, some inspiration for you in terms of the things that you might want to do. So this is from Nico. So he's got his motion sensor, his Arduino, his Raspberry Pi. He's actually got some other physical sensors, light sensors, door sensors. And so he's basically sending motion tracking data into Google Analytics. So what might you want to do with that? So before I go further, so this is just some Python code. So you can see it's hopefully Python users here, developers. Yeah. So you probably know this better than me. So we've got a motion detector, and then it's doing something every second, and it's just hitting GA. So we've prepared our URL request. So you can see some of the parameters in here. So the TID uses Google Analytics tracking ID. It's got an event as a hit type, and he's labeling it as movement in the living room. And you get this. You get a Google Analytics powered sleep tracker using motion sensors. So obviously highly scientific, but I think it's quite interesting in terms of, with very little code and very little equipment that you can do something like that. So when I saw Nico do this, I thought, oh, let's see what I can do. So Raspberry Pi, webcam, and a bit of face detection. So using the OpenCV library, which is a great library for processing images, you can basically use the webcam and detect the number of faces. So this is something, I think this is DevFest 2018, I think it was. So all this is doing is just counting faces. So we're not doing any face recognition here. All it's doing is how many faces can it see in the room, and then pushing that data. So this was, you can actually see this camera was in one of the rooms throughout the event. You can see it was very popular in the morning, and then in the afternoon it's like, oh, I gotta go shopping, go pick up the kids, need to go swimming. And the code behind that is very similar to Nico's in terms of Python. It's just using the process data out of OpenCV and then just pushing it into Google Analytics. Instrumentation and error logging. I'm not going to show you the video, but so this is an example from a friend of mine, Bruce McPherson. So he publishes a number of Google Apps Script libraries, and as part of that, he basically includes in his library a heartbeat. So the library will occasionally just hit Google Analytics with the version number. So he can, when he pushes out new library versions, he can actually see who's upgrading to the next version of his library from his Google Analytics data. So he's just put a line of code into his project. I think he was using this in Excel spreadsheets as well. So in fact, let me show you the video. So I think he's just run a macro, and you can see in real time that it's the hits are being recorded into Google Analytics. So it's not just version control. There's actually within Google Analytics there's an error hit type. So if you're running script, obviously there are other products now that you can use like stack driver logging, which might be better in terms of monitoring whether or not your code is starting to fail or has bugs. But that functionality also exists in Google Analytics. So some other things that you can do is API matching. So just hitting APIs for data, processing that data. So the example Nico did was a Slack bot where I think he was processing each of the messages within the thread, and he was doing things like counting the number of question marks. So it's like, how inquisitive is this thread, or how confused is this thread? I did one where I was pushing Canvas is a learning management system and has discussion boards, and so I was taking basically the discussion boards and then basically pushing who was replying to threads, so using a client ID to push in who was replying to threads, how many threads they were replying to, etc. And then just using Google Analytics to look at that data. You might ask, why go to all that trouble? It's like, it seemed like fun. Why wouldn't you want to go to all that trouble? So in terms of reporting, Google Analytics has a very good web-based dashboard that you can do stuff. So you can drill down into the data, you can do segmenting, so there's a lot there. But if you're finding you're hitting banners with that, Google Analytics actually have APIs for you to pull back reporting data. So the view that you get in Google Analytics of the data you're pushing in might not necessarily be the view that you want, because I'm really interested in G Suite products. I have to mention the fact that Google Analytics have an add-on for Google Sheets. So this way you can connect to your Google Analytics account, set up the type of data that you want to pull back from your account, and it will just dump that into a Google Sheet for you, and it can run automated. So if you want a weekly report on this data, you can easily set this up and then look impressive to your boss as you send reports that he thinks you've slaved hours over, but you just run a script on and you're going out playing golf. Some other interesting things you might want to do with Google Analytics data. So one of the things that you get with website tracking within Google Analytics is you can see the referral path. So when someone clicks a link on another website into your own website, you can see where they've come from. So, for example, on Twitter, if someone tweets a link to your website, there are a couple of things that you can do to actually track the impact of that tweet in terms of generating traffic. So the reason you might want to do that is if you've got members of your community who are particularly good at driving content or traffic to your website, those might be people that you want to look after, invite them to events and so on. So one of the things that you can do in Google Analytics is actually look at the referral path. So now that Twitter handily wraps every link that you share on Twitter in a unique shortened URL, you can actually track these. So, for example, I don't know if I'll show it. So what this slide is showing is when Twitter basically display URLs behind the scene, it sends you through their shortening service. So links don't look like they're shortened, but they actually are. So and each of the shortened links is unique. So if someone else shares the same link, it'll get a different shortened URL. So there's a little recipe here that means that, for example, when Scott Turner shared that link to my website, I can see it generated 7 new visits and 9 visitors, and so there's a link there. Hopefully it explains it a bit better than I just did then. So in summary, hopefully this has given you some inspiration in terms of things that are possible with Google Analytics. Hopefully it's kind of lifted the lid slightly on Pandora's box. And hopefully it's inspired you to go off and rethink about Google Analytics in perhaps some slightly creative or / crazy ways. My advice if you're looking at something like analytics is to think lean. So there are a lot of opportunities with something like Google Analytics to start developing very complex dashboards, but sometimes the basic information is the information people really want.